Hello, welcome to my channel, Save Infinity. In this video, I just wanted to kind of quickly, talk about the idea through more of like a metaphor of, our greater reality and how it can kind of be, more like a dream or a video game in that sort of sense. And so, it's almost like we were born with like a VR headset on, if you will. And so the only reality we ever like saw or kind of knew was like, through this VR reality headset, if you could imagine. And then so, we grew up with that on, thinking this was, the be all end all reality that we were perceiving. And so we just came accustomed to kind of, like feeling and believing that this is our whole entire reality, not realizing it's, just a slither of what reality really is, and that you can, like take those VR headsets off. And, you can imagine as well if we had like advanced and immersive enough, VR type games, which I'm sure we would in the future, just how imagine, if you were like born in the game, born wearing such a headset, always immersed in such a game, like how easy it would be to relate to that game as being your whole soul reality and all that is. So in that sense, kind of like how our soul is, in a human vessel experiencing this human reality is almost like a VR headset on our soul, and it's just, being immersed in a sort of game with certain parameters and what have you. And and in that same sense, how you can also kind of see and perceive and understand that so many things like around and in our reality are kind of more like ones and zeros, just neutral coding, appearing and manifested based off your specific experience. But they're more, like ones and zeros and such, a neutral coding that kind of then gives you the impression of like an experience, or a feeling or a sensation or what have you. But all that sort of, magic of the feeling of being alive all actually comes from within you, and can just be, triggered by certain things outside of you that, trigger that magic within you. But that magic is still always within you and doesn't need to rely on the outside, ones and zeros or what have you to be triggered. Which is easier said than done, of course. You kind of think of it, similar to like a video game or what have you, in that sense, how, everything is made from, the coding and what have you, and then it knows, when certain things happen, then that means, a certain something happens and occurs, which is very similar parameters to our own reality. And it's kind of like the coding of the reality around us is continuously feeding like information to our own vessel that then receives that and manifests that like into a felt experience, if you will. Even with things, like temperature or pain or what have you, it's kind of like, like a coded thing that, your vessel interprets as, oh, this means it's hot and this is what hot feels like. This means it's cold and this is what cold feels like. But all those feelings and sensations, pleasure, pain, discomfort, happiness, all those like feelings and emotions and what have you, all actually come from within you and are you, because you are the infinite field of everything. And then it's kind of like through this experience, you're then having certain, things occur in your reality that then trigger those sort of responses, allowing you to explore such happenings. Kind of like how it feels like we can touch and feel and grab things in a way that, reality seems physical, but all that is also just, like a programmed illusion as well. And, you get down to a microscopic point and, nothing's actually touching anything. It's kind of just like, vibrating against each other and, energetically sending little messages to each other that gives a feeling and an experience of, you know, physical touch, but it's not actually technically physically touching at all. You know, it's the more we kind of collectively awaken and like understand those sort of things, you know, how all of that is kind of coming from within, and you know, the outside reality is more just, you know, a code of ones and zeros, if you will, that kind of trigger these responses or feelings, or you know, or what have you, within us to create this experience we're immersed in. But then being able to then get to a point of being able to kind of shift within yourself what that set code of ones and zeros means and should be represented as, or even being able to, you know, manifest or experience, you know, such happenings or what have you, without needing to first rely on the coding from the outside ones and zeros to come and trigger that for you, being able to just trigger it within yourself first and foremost. And that's when you kind of really do get to more of those sort of, you know, bend the spoon in the matrix type ideas of, you know, of like really reshaping and bending the reality around you, because it all already is from within you, you know, and that everything kind of outside of you is kind of like, you know, neutral coding of ones and zeros. And then it's the way that, you know, your vessel is interpreting that code, you know, whether it be through, you know, human societal programming, you know, the way you were brought up, or, you know, certain particular experiences that have happened to you, or what have you. But, you know, all your beliefs and thoughts and, you know, logical reasoning and education and religion and spirituality and so many ideas and aspects that, you know, you were either already born with, or your body was already programmed with, or you kind of just came in with from, you know, your soul or past lives or what have you. It all, you know, congregates and formulates the way you kind of do experience and perceive, you know, that neutral coding of ones and zeros. And so, you know, which is great to give us a great, you know, foundational basis to kind of work from, rather than trying to, you know, do that from a sea of infinity where anything could mean anything and everything. You know, it gives you a nice grounded base to work from. But then the more we're able to kind of, you know, understand and integrate that foundational base while simultaneously opening ourselves up, you know, consciously, and, you know, expanding our awareness in those aspects, the more we're then able to kind of reformulate our own program, or, you know, redefine, you know, the workings and the happenings of the code around us in a way that, you know, benefits and aligns with you more sovereignly and more personally, kind of being able to, you know, kind of take those training wheels off a bit, and kind of learn to fly for yourself in a sense. You can kind of think of, you know, the certain rules and perceptions of the kind of, you know, current coding of reality, if you will. You know, it gives you that nice foundational basis, that nice little nest to, you know, grow up in and get some understanding and some, you know, a bit of a story background or what have you, as, you know, like a little jumping pad to jump from into a sea of infinity, to, you know, give you a way of being able to feel and experience as a something or a someone in a greater reality, rather than it all just being kerfuffled and merged together. You know, it gives you some foundational like rules and grounding to base, you know, a life experience from. But then, you know, being able to kind of loosen the chains and the training wheels on that a bit, if you have, if you will, and then you can kind of, you know, jump off or fly off into an even more broader, more expanded realm of experiencing reality in a way that's, you know, more shaped to the journey you're embarking on. You know, and then so instead of just, you know, always just existing in a way that you're relying completely on, you know, the ones and zeros outside of you to trigger certain responses and feelings and emotions or what have you within you, you know, getting to a point of being able to kind of just manifest that for yourself automatically without needing the outside to trigger what's already within you, because it already is you. That's almost just acting as like a mirror to remind you of what is within yourself. You know, and you are an infinite portal in that sense of infinite divinity. So, you know, there's so many little tunnels and crevices to, you know, explore and be found in that sense. And so just kind of taking a little more sovereign, you know, ownership and authorship back over the story and experience of your life, rather than just letting the ones and zeros outside of you kind of just, you know, taking you down a story lane. You know, another reason why we can, you know, tend to experience, you know, so much pain or trauma or things like that within this reality as a way of, you know, like waking us up. You know, it's kind of like if you're in a, you know, a happy, pleasant dream for long enough, you kind of probably just get so used to it and kind of, you know, almost like doze off and become a little more unconscious in that sense. And then it's when you have, you know, the really scary, you know, terrible nightmare that can kind of, you know, wake you up a bit and make you realize, oh, I am just dreaming. And then you can kind of drift yourself back to a more pleasant dream, but more awake and aware, and then have like a more like lucid dreaming experience. You know, I feel like that's kind of the cycle we kind of go through. You know, we spend so much time in this, you know, lucid, wonderful dreaming experience where, you know, we can explore this infinite realm of ourselves. But after a while, you know, it's so pleasant and just becomes so normal that we almost fall back asleep within the dream, lose a bit of that lucidity, and then it can kind of, you know, start to trickle down into becoming like a nightmare. And then, you know, it's that nightmare gets nightmarish enough that it kind of wakes you back up and makes you, you know, wakes you back up to the fact that you are dreaming within a dream. So then you can, you know, kind of take on that sovereign lucid control a bit more and dream yourself back into a more pleasant dream, where you then have the conscious lucid awareness to really explore and enjoy it once again. All right, well, I might leave this one here for now, but sending you so much peace, love, light, and blessings as always.